A judge faces the ultimate test of justice when the defendant in her courtroom is her childhood best friend, falsely accused and fighting a system stacked against him. The courtroom was already abuzz with anticipation as Judge Elizabeth Carter took her seat at the bench. Known for her poise and unshakable demeanor, Elizabeth scanned the room with sharp eyes that missed nothing. This wasn't her first high-profile case, and she carried the weight of decades in the judiciary on her shoulders. But something about today felt different, though she couldn't put her finger on why. As the prosecutor began his opening remarks, she adjusted her glasses and settled into the rhythm of the trial. The defendant hadn't yet been brought in. Elizabeth glanced at the papers in front of her. The charges were serious: armed robbery and assault. Yet the details were oddly vague, and the evidence appeared thin, even at first glance. A small frown creased her forehead. The bailiff's voice broke through her thoughts. "All rise for the defendant." Elizabeth looked up. Her pen paused mid-air. The man who walked into the courtroom was strikingly familiar. His eyes, though worn with years of hardship, carried a spark she'd seen before. A spark from another lifetime. She sat frozen as recognition hit her like a wave. It was Andrew Davis, the boy she used to climb trees with, who shared his sandwiches with her when her lunchbox was empty. The one who made her laugh so hard she cried when life in their small, dusty Alabama town felt unbearably heavy. The same boy who vanished from her life nearly 40 years ago. Elizabeth blinked, trying to regain her composure, but her chest tightened. This wasn't just any defendant. This was her childhood friend, a man she hadn't seen since they were kids, now standing before her in handcuffs. But as the proceedings began, she couldn't shake the question echoing in her mind. How had Andrew ended up here? Elizabeth couldn't take her eyes off Andrew. His shoulders were hunched, weighed down by more than just the chains around his wrists. The once vibrant boy she remembered was now a man who looked older than his years. His gaze swept the courtroom, and when their eyes met, he froze for a moment, recognition flickering across his face. The prosecutor's voice cut through the silence. "Your Honor, the defendant, Andrew Davis, stands accused of armed robbery and aggravated assault at the North Point gas station on October 12th. Elizabeth fought to maintain her composure. "Noted," she said, her tone carefully neutral. She motioned for the trial to proceed, but her mind was racing. Memories of their childhood flooded back unbidden. Andrew's family had always struggled, his father working odd jobs and his mother sewing clothes to make ends meet. Yet Andrew had a way of carrying himself as though he was destined for something greater. They were best friends, inseparable, until the day her family moved away. After that, letters stopped coming, and life moved on. She'd always wondered what had happened to him. But now she knew. He'd ended up here, in her courtroom, accused of a crime that didn't add up. Andrew's court-appointed attorney, a young woman named Monica Hayes, stood and began to speak. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty. We contend that he was not at the scene of the crime, and that the evidence presented by the prosecution is circumstantial at best." The prosecutor, a sharp man in his mid-40s, smirked as if the defense's argument was a personal affront. "Your Honor, we have video surveillance from the scene and an eyewitness account placing Mr. Davis at the gas station." Elizabeth leaned forward. "Proceed with the evidence, Counselor." The prosecutor presented grainy footage from a security camera. The figure in the video wore a hooded sweatshirt, their face partially obscured. The timestamp matched the time of the crime, but it was far from conclusive. Next, he called a witness, a cashier who claimed to have seen Andrew. The witness hesitated under cross-examination, admitting he hadn't gotten a good look at the perpetrator. Elizabeth's focus shifted to Andrew as he sat quietly at the defense table. She saw no anger, no defiance, just exhaustion, the kind that comes from years of fighting battles no one else sees. Her heart clenched as she heard herself say, "The evidence presented will be reviewed carefully. This court is committed to fairness above all else." But as the day went on, Elizabeth couldn't shake the sinking feeling that Andrew wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting against a system that had already decided his fate. The second day of the trial began under a cloud of tension that seemed to permeate the courtroom. Elizabeth arrived early, as always, meticulously reviewing the evidence and witness statements before proceedings began. Yet the more she examined the case, the more glaring the gaps became. The prosecution's reliance on the grainy footage and the shaky eyewitness testimony felt like a desperate attempt to tie Andrew to a crime he might not have committed. Andrew sat silently at the defense table, his hands clasped in front of him. He avoided Elizabeth's gaze, though she caught him glancing in her direction occasionally, as if trying to reconcile the woman behind the bench with the girl he once knew. Monica Hayes, his attorney, began her cross-examination of the key witness, the cashier. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, her tone calm but firm, "you testified yesterday that you saw the defendant at the scene of the crime. Can you describe him for the court?" The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Well, he was wearing a hoodie, kind of tall, dark skin." "And you're certain it was Mr. Davis?" Monica pressed. "Well, I mean, yeah, I think so." Monica stepped closer, holding up a still image from the security footage. "This is the suspect you identified. Would you agree that the face is not clearly visible?" Jenkins hesitated, his eyes darting to the prosecutor for support. "I guess, yeah, it's not clear. And yet, you claimed under oath that you're sure it was my client." The prosecutor quickly objected, but the damage was done. Elizabeth could see the seeds of doubt planted in the jury's minds. Still, she knew it wasn't enough. Public defenders like Monica were often under-resourced, and without solid evidence to prove Andrew's innocence, his fate remained uncertain. The next piece of evidence, a fingerprint found on the counter, was presented by the prosecution. It matched Andrew's, but Monica pointed out that Andrew had frequented the gas station in the past, making the fingerprint inconclusive. The prosecutor, growing increasingly frustrated, doubled down on the narrative that Andrew had a history of trouble. "Your Honor," he said, "the defendant has a prior record of petty theft. This pattern of behavior cannot be ignored." Elizabeth's stomach turned. She remembered Andrew as a boy, how he once stole a loaf of bread from a corner store because his siblings were hungry. Was this the so-called pattern they were using to brand him as a criminal? She forced herself to remain impartial, even as a voice inside her screamed at the injustice of it all. During a recess, Elizabeth found herself staring out the window of her chambers, the weight of the case pressing heavily on her shoulders. The law was clear. She was to judge based on evidence, not emotion. Yet how could she ignore the systemic bias playing out before her eyes? When court resumed, Andrew finally took the stand. His voice was steady, but laced with quiet frustration as he recounted the night of the crime. He had been home, he said, watching TV with his neighbor, an elderly woman who couldn't attend court, but had provided a written affidavit. He admitted to his troubled past, but insisted he'd turned his life around. "I'm not that kid anymore," he said, his eyes momentarily meeting Elizabeth's. "I've made mistakes, but I've worked hard to stay out of trouble. I didn't do this." The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Elizabeth couldn't deny the truth in his tone, the raw honesty that didn't fit the profile of a man guilty of the crime he was accused of. But the prosecution wasn't done. And as the trial continued, Elizabeth realized that the system she upheld for so many years might not just fail Andrew, it might break them both. Elizabeth sat behind the bench, her face a mask of calm authority. Inside, however, a storm was raging. The evidence presented so far was weak, riddled with inconsistencies. But she knew how the system worked. It wasn't about fairness. It was about perception. A black man with a prior record, no matter how minor, was an easy target for those eager to close a case. She had seen it before, but this time it felt personal, cutting into her core. As Andrew's testimony concluded, the prosecutor rose for cross-examination. His tone was sharp, condescending, each question aimed at chipping away at Andrew's credibility. "So, Mr. Davis," he began, pacing slowly, "you claim you were at home on the night of October 12th. "That's right," Andrew replied firmly. "And your only alibi is a written statement from your neighbor, a statement, I might add, that cannot be verified because she conveniently isn't here today." Andrew's jaw tightened, but he held his composure. "She's 87. Traveling isn't easy for her." "Convenient indeed," the prosecutor sneered, turning to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a man with a history of theft, caught on camera at the scene of the crime, trying to escape accountability." Monica Hayes shot to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making unfounded assumptions." "Sustained," Elizabeth said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Stick to the facts, Counselor." The prosecutor nodded but didn't lose his smug expression. "Of course, Your Honor." He turned back to Andrew. "Tell me, Mr. Davis, do you deny that you've been arrested before?" Andrew hesitated, glancing briefly at Elizabeth. "No, I don't deny it. I made mistakes when I was younger." "And yet here you are again. Same story, different crime." Elizabeth's hands clenched under the desk. The implication was clear, and she could see some jurors nodding subtly, buying into the narrative the prosecutor was weaving. She wanted to interrupt, to remind them that a prior record didn't make someone guilty of a new crime. But she couldn't. Her role demanded impartiality, even as her heart screamed otherwise. That night, Elizabeth sat alone in her chambers long after everyone else had left. The courtroom, once a place where she felt she could make a difference, now felt like a battleground where justice was losing. She thought about Andrew as a boy, the laughter they shared, the dreams they whispered under the shade of the big oak tree in their hometown. He'd always been kind, always looking out for others, even when life dealt him a cruel hand. But life had changed them both. She had climbed the ranks, earning respect and authority in a system she now questioned. He had been left behind, swallowed by circumstances beyond his control. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Monica, carrying a thick folder. "Judge Carter," she said hesitantly, "I know I'm not supposed to approach you like this, but I need you to see this." Elizabeth's eyebrows furrowed. "You know the rules, Ms. Hayes." "I do," Monica said, her voice trembling. "But the stakes are too high. This isn't just about Andrew, it's about what's right." Elizabeth hesitated, but nodded for Monica to continue. Monica laid the folder on the desk, flipping it open to reveal documents and photographs. "I did some digging. The gas station's owner has ties to the lead investigator on this case. They've worked together before, and there are reports of similar cases where suspects were coerced into confessions or wrongfully accused." Elizabeth felt her breath catch. "And this wasn't brought up during discovery?" "No," Monica replied. "I only found it because I didn't stop looking. But I don't have the resources or the time to present this properly before the jury." Elizabeth closed the folder, her mind racing. If she allowed this evidence to come to light, it could expose a deeply ingrained bias in the system, a bias she had always known existed but rarely had the power to confront directly. Yet doing so could also jeopardize her position, her reputation, and everything she had worked for. The decision weighed heavy on her, but Elizabeth knew that the truth, once seen, could not be ignored. She just didn't know if she was ready to risk everything to reveal it. The next morning, Elizabeth arrived at the courthouse early, Monica's revelations still fresh in her mind. She reviewed the folder again, carefully noting the connections Monica had uncovered. The implications were staggering. If true, the case against Andrew wasn't just flawed. It was a deliberate fabrication, built on a foundation of systemic corruption. As the trial resumed, Elizabeth struggled to maintain her professional demeanor. Her gavel struck sharply to call the room to order. "Proceed," she said, her voice steady, though inside, her thoughts churned like a storm. Monica rose from her seat with renewed determination. "Your Honor, I'd like to recall Detective Robert Kendall to the stand." The detective, a stocky man with a self-assured air, took the stand. He was confident. Too confident, Elizabeth thought. Monica began her questioning with a calm yet probing tone. "Detective Kendall, how long have you been working with the department?" 20 years, he replied, flashing a practiced smile. "And in that time, how often have you collaborated with local businesses, such as the owner of North Point gas station?" The detective's smile faltered slightly. "Occasionally, for community outreach or investigations." "Investigations like this one?" Monica asked, tilting her head. "Yes," he said cautiously. Monica stepped closer, holding up a document from the folder. "Detective Kendall, are you aware that the gas station owner, Mr. Carson, has filed multiple complaints against young black men in the area, several of which resulted in arrests that were later overturned due to lack of evidence?" The courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor immediately objected. "Your Honor, this line of questioning is irrelevant." Elizabeth looked directly at the prosecutor, her voice firm. "Overruled. Continue, Ms. Hayes." Monica pressed on. "Detective Kendall, did you investigate those complaints thoroughly, or were the arrests made based solely on Mr. Carson's accusations?" "I followed protocol," Kendall stammered. "Protocol," Monica repeated, her tone sharp. "And does protocol include ignoring potential conflicts of interest? Because Mr. Carson has financial ties to you, doesn't he?" Kendall's face turned pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." Monica didn't relent. "Your Honor, I have here bank records showing a series of payments from Mr. Carson to Detective Kendall over the past 5 years. These records were not disclosed during discovery." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Elizabeth's chest tightened. The implications were damning, and the jury's expressions revealed that they were beginning to question the entire narrative. The prosecutor rose again, visibly flustered. "Your Honor, this evidence was obtained outside the scope of the trial. It should be inadmissible." Elizabeth paused, the weight of the moment pressing on her. "Ms. Hayes, I'll allow this evidence, but you'll need to provide its relevance to this case." Monica nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. These payments suggest a pattern of collusion between Mr. Carson and Detective Kendall, casting doubt on the integrity of this investigation and the charges brought against my client." As Monica continued to lay out the evidence, Elizabeth noticed Andrew sitting at the defense table, his expression a mixture of hope and disbelief. For the first time, the tide seemed to be turning in his favor. When court adjourned for the day, Elizabeth retreated to her chambers, her mind racing. The revelations were explosive, but they also put her in an impossible position. She could expose the corruption, ensuring justice for Andrew, but risking her career in the process. Or she could let the system take its course, knowing it would crush an innocent man. As she stared at the folder on her desk, Elizabeth realized that the choice before her wasn't just about Andrew. It was about the very principles she had sworn to uphold. And for the first time in years, she wasn't sure what to do. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was filled with an electric tension. Elizabeth took her seat, her face unreadable as she prepared to deliver a decision that would ripple far beyond the walls of this courtroom. Monica Hayes delivered her closing arguments with passion, her voice steady and unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this trial is not just about Andrew Davis. It's about a system that too often sees people as statistics rather than individuals. Andrew is not a number, nor a case file. He's a man who has worked hard to leave his mistakes behind, only to be dragged back by assumptions and prejudice. You have the power to see through the cracks in this case and do what is right." The prosecutor attempted to counter, but his arguments felt hollow after the revelations of corruption. The jury's expressions made it clear they were no longer convinced by his narrative. When it was time for Elizabeth to issue her final instructions to the jury, she spoke with a clarity that surprised even herself. You have heard the arguments, seen the evidence, and witnessed the weaknesses in this case. Your decision today must be based on truth, not assumptions or bias. The responsibility lies in your hands. Hours later, the jury returned with their verdict. Not guilty, the foreman announced. A wave of emotion swept through the room. Andrew let out a shaky breath, tears filling his eyes as he turned to Monica, whispering his thanks. Elizabeth watched silently, her chest tightening with a mix of relief and resolve. As she stepped down from the bench that evening, Elizabeth knew one thing. Justice wasn't perfect, but it was worth fighting for, even when the fight came at a cost. To stand for fairness, even when it's hard, is a choice we all must make. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more like it.